You're listening to The Central Cast, a podcast for mystics and misfits just like you. The Central Cast is recorded before a live audience every week at our church in Glendale, California. Thanks for tuning in.
I want to talk today about the role that crisis plays in faith formation. A lot of people don't know this, but the 66 books of the Bible were written because of social and political crises in Israel's history, namely the Babylonian conquest of Judah in and around the year 590 BCE, and the subsequent deporting and exile of the people to Babylon. It was this crisis that made them write down and record their stories, their traditions, their beliefs, their culture into what we call, the Old Testament, what Jews call the Hebrew Bible. Prior to this, it's likely their stories and traditions were passed down orally. But again, to be clear, it was this social and political crisis of being conquered and facing annihilation and losing their history, their stories, and their traditions forever that made them write it down. And it's why we still have these books today. And if you don't know this, the Old Testament is actually the largest portion of the Bible. If you were to compare the New Testament to the Old Testament, it's about the Old Testament's about 2/3 larger. So I'm not just talking about the 16 books of the prophets that were written during or after the exile, but the whole thing from Genesis to Malachi. Most scholars believe it was during or after the exile, again, that these books were written. And to be clear, the exile wasn't just what caused them to be written, but the exile, the trauma, the crisis of being conquered, the temple being destroyed, the people being deported, taken away into slavery to Babylon, that trauma, that crisis really informed a theology, the faith within specifically the 16 books of the prophets. And if you read the prophets, you'll discover that the crisis of the exile deeply informed their understanding of God and what it meant to be his people. This is because the prophets set out to answer questions like, why would God allow us to be conquered and destroyed by foreign adversaries, Gentiles, no less? Why would he allow his holy temple to be laid waste? Why would he allow his chosen people to be taken away in slavery, deported to a foreign nation? Why? Why? And the reason the prophets came up with largely was that the nation was being punished for their sins of idolatry and injustice. And those two sins were really related. In other words, God's main beef with his people was that they didn't care for the poor, and they practiced violence and fraud with each other. They practiced injustice in the land. And part of the reason why is because often they were worshiping foreign deities that did not teach them to be just and good with each other, like Yahweh did. Their idolatry was part and parcel to their practice of injustice in the land. And it was for these reasons that the prophets believed God lifted his hand of protection off of the nation, off of his people, and allowed them to be destroyed. Now, to be clear, I'm not saying this is actually true. The exile is absolutely true. The conquest, the Babylonian conquest of Judah, is absolutely true. That really happened. That's real history. But I personally, don't believe anymore that I don't believe in a violent, vindictive God who would use murder, rape, and exile to teach his people a lesson. But this is what they believe. This is what the prophets taught. This is how they understood it. This is how they interpreted the incomprehensible crisis and trauma of being destroyed, being conquered, and being thrown into exile. They couldn't accept that there was just a mundane reason for this, like that Babylon was the most powerful empire in the region, and Judah, like many other nation states at that time, were small and not as powerful and were easy targets. They couldn't accept a mundane, prosaic, worldly explanation like that. Devout people of faith often need a theological reason for what befalls them, when the real answer is often prosaic and practical. In other words, it's far more comforting to believe that God is punishing us, or that we're being tested, in our faith when something terrible happens to us, rather than believe that either God doesn't exist or isn't all powerful or isn't concerned with our problems. It's far more comforting to believe that, we're being tested or we're being punished, right? Than to believe that God isn't in control and we are subject to time and chance and the random and chaotic forces of nature and the forces of empire. People of faith have always used their faith and theology to avoid a confrontation with the real, meaning the fact that we are subject to time and chance, that we are subject to the laws of nature and the powerful. And God is not in control like we think he is. That's kind of a scary idea, right? We don't want to hear that. We certainly don't want to show up to church on Sunday morning and hear it from a guy like me. You want to be told God's in control and everything's going to be okay if you just believe, do his will. You won't end up like the Israelites, decimated and destroyed and cast into exile. God will protect you. When terrible things happen, there must be some hidden reason for this. God must be testing you or punishing you for some hidden sin. I remember growing up, anytime my siblings and I ever got sick with a cold or a flu bug, my dad would go into his room and pray and ask God, why is Aaron throwing up in the bathroom? and he would inevitably come back and tell me something like, you've got some sin in your life, Aaron. God told me, literally he told me. My dad tells me this, not God. He would say, you have been rebellious lately in the house, and God has lifted his hand of protection off of you and allowed this terrible thing, this flu bug to, infect your body as a way of bringing you into repentance and back to him. It's the same old story. Thousands of years old. You find it way back in the Bronze Age with the Israelites, the people of Judah being conquered and deported. This reasoning that the prophets came up with, the retribution principle, as scholars call it, we find a similar thing going on in the New Testament, particularly in the Gospels, which were written during or after the First Jewish-Roman War, which led to the siege of Jerusalem and its fall, the temple being looted by, I think it was General Titus, and the diaspora, meaning the dispersion of the Israelites around the Mediterranean world, their departure from the Holy Land, as it's known, right? This was very much like the Babylonian conquest 600 years prior, and the exile. And for this reason, one can read the Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, at least in part as being a prophetic response to this crisis, to this cataclysmic event in Israel's history. The Gospels can function as a way of explaining it the way the prophets explained it, did hundreds of years prior. The message being, God allowed Rome to sack and destroy you, to sack the temple even, and cast the people into diaspora because you missed the day of your visitation. You mistreated and rejected God's prophet, the Messiah, Jesus of Nazareth, and his message of love, equality, and justice. You rejected it all. You missed your day of visitation. And now you will be sent into exile again. You will be destroyed, the temple destroyed again. And your nation will fall into the hands of foreigners yet again. See the similarities between the prophets and the Gospels? For this reason, I think the Gospels can be read, at least in part. They're complex, not entirely, but at least in part, as a Hebrew prophetic response, as part of this Hebrew prophetic tradition, Hebrew prophetic literature, and as a way of theologically explaining the social and political crises of that time, of the First Jewish-Roman War, and why the nation succumbed. Consider also the book of Revelation, right? The end of the New Testament, the last book in the Bible. There's no question the book of Revelation was written because of the social political crises facing the church at the end of the first century, where Christians were being persecuted and even put to death by Rome for their refusal to worship the emperor, for their refusal to participate in what was known as the Roman imperial cult, the worship of the emperor. There's no question that the book of Revelation, sorry if you were into Tim LaHaye and Left Behind series, but there's no question that the book of Revelation was born out of this out of this social and political crises at the end of the first century and the felt need of Christians then, like John of Patmos, who wrote it while in exile on an island in the Mediterranean Sea, hiding from the Romans himself. There's no question that this book was written and born out of this social and political crises and the need to explain it theologically through the ancient genre of what was known as apocalyptic literature. If you've read the book of Revelation, you know that it's just rife with symbolism and metaphor, all this cosmological imagery and supernatural imagery of dragons and angels and demons and seals and scrolls being unfurled, all this cosmological, all this symbolism and metaphor. The purpose was to implore early Christians in the churches of mostly Asia Minor, around the Mediterranean Sea there in Western Asia Minor. The purpose was to implore early Christians to keep the faith and resist this evil and unjust empire that's trying to force you to worship it. Keep the faith and resist the empire because Jesus was ultimately greater than Caesar. And even if you died at the hands of the Romans in the arena for refusing to participate in the imperial cult, relax, because you're going to live again in the world to come. And you will live in victory with Christ and all the holy angels and the saints. The victory will be yours in the end, and Christ in the world to come. That's the story. That was the message of the book of Revelation. Again, a message born out of political and social crises that deeply inform people's faith. And I say all this today not just to give us a deeper understanding of the Bible and what caused it to be, but to ask ourselves, how has our faith been shaped and informed by political and social crises in our day and time? Because I think it has. I think in particular, the culture war, as it's known, that began in the 20th century and has carried over now into the 21st. This is a social and political crisis that has shaped and is still shaping our faith, and specifically the church, right? The American Christian church, aka evangelicalism, right? One could understand the rise of the far right and the MAGA movement as being born out of a profound sense of crisis among evangelicals that they are losing the culture war to the secular left, to the socialists, to the LGBT community, and basically anybody that isn't straight, white, and Christian. One can understand the rise of evangelical power, the MAGA movement, far right, as very much an evangelical, theological, spiritual reaction to this social and political crisis, aka the culture war. To such a degree that many evangelicals today, as you well know, have come to embrace a kind of authoritarianism, quasi-fascism, theocratic faith in politics, to such a degree that even Jesus is often seen as too woke for them now. I'm not making this up. I have read of numerous pastors being confronted after their sermons on Sunday mornings in centrist evangelical churches, being confronted by parishioners saying, Jesus didn't really say that, did he? After the pastor preached the Sermon on the Mount, Matthew 5. And Jesus didn't really say, blessed are the poor, did he? Jesus didn't really side with the poor and powerless against the rich, did he? He didn't show really preferential treatment for the poor and powerless and the vulnerable, did he? He was on the side of the rich folk. He was good for business, wasn't he? They really have lost the story, lost the plot completely. And it's astonishing. This is what evangelicals are saying today when confronted with the Jesus found in the Gospels. One must wonder if they ever actually understood the Gospels in the first place or read them in the first place. One must wonder, what did they believe prior to this moment? The lack of biblical literacy out there in the church today is astonishing. This is why I've endeavored, even after I graduated from Fuller, I won't get into Fuller at the moment, I've got problems with them now, but 15 years ago when I graduated, 16 years ago when I graduated from Fuller, I really wanted to be a pastor that helped people with biblical literacy. I believed that the seminary, what I was learning in the seminary, needed to be taught to the pews on Sunday morning. This idea that there should be a disparity there, that what pastors learn in seminary, needs to be dumbed down for the church. That was terrible. I came into this into this profession, believing that biblical literacy was of the utmost importance. And this is why. This is a perfect example. This moment in history is a perfect example why. It's ironic that so many evangelicals claim to practically worship the Bible and call themselves, biblical and having a biblical worldview, and yet are woefully inept at understanding even the most superficial understanding of it, and that of Jesus of Nazareth, their God. If they had even the most superficial understanding, they would know not only that Jesus' gospel was a gospel of peace and liberation for the poor and oppressed, but they would also know that the prophets of the Old Testament had the same message. Moreover, they would know that King Uzziah, the king of Judah at the time of the exile, the Babylonian conquest, that this king bears a striking resemblance to the rulers evangelicals revere today. King Uzziah, we're told, was really good for the economy, really good for the rich, really good for business, really good for trade and for the military, but really bad for the poor and the powerless and the vulnerable. And because so, he was labeled by the prophets as an evil and wicked king. Notice, he wasn't labeled a good king because he was good for business. He was good for the economy. He was good for the rich. This is not what made him a good king. He was labeled as evil and wicked. Why? Because of the way that he was unjust and treated the poor and the powerless and built a culture that mistreated the poor and the powerless and practiced violence in the land, exploitation, etc. I mean, imagine for a moment you're an evangelical. Sorry, I know that's a bit triggering, but imagine for a moment you're an evangelical again, and you read these texts literally and believe that God literally punished his chosen people for the way that they mistreated the poor. Wouldn't you feel some cognitive dissonance today for being so supportive of the so-called Christian leaders that are doing the same? Just this week, the House passed what's known as the Big Beautiful Bill, the budget reconciliation, 1,000 pages. And this bill will make significant cuts to Medicaid, Medicare, and food stamps and other federal programs that help the poor and the most vulnerable, and allocate those funds instead towards defense spending and tax cuts for the most wealthy. It is an astonishing piece of legislation. Never before in U.S. history has any bill proposed such a massive redistribution of wealth upwards. We're talking about trillions of dollars over the next 10 years, taken from the most poor and giving it to the most rich. And the outcry from the evangelical church is zero, nil, nothing. In fact, one may even assume they probably support it and think it's God's will, just like House Speaker Mike Johnson does, who, along with other evangelical lawmakers, prayed and thanked God after they passed the bill for him helping them do so. Which again is astonishing if you actually read the prophets and the gospel. It is astonishing. But let's not pretend that most evangelicals are reading that closely, reading the text that closely anyway, right? I just find it fascinating, and another example of how the culture war, this social and political crises of our time, has so misshaped Christianity in America and twisted it into something that is antichrist. Question, of course, becomes, how is our faith, how is our Christianity being shaped and reshaped by the culture war and by the political and social crises we're facing today? How has your faith been shaped and formed by the social and political crises of our time over the years? Or perhaps, I also want to ask you, how has personal crises in your own personal life shaped and informed your faith over the years? I just want to open the floor today with those questions. Are there any questions or comments about what I talked about today regarding the scriptures and how they came to be, but the role of the crises, political and otherwise, has played in our faith formation? Yeah, is that a Keela? Hey, Keela. I'm just going to use the podcast mic so people can hear you. Where's the mic? There it is.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, thank you for your talk. I know you don't like when I call them a sermon. Thank you for your talk. Yeah, I have a lot of comments about what you just said. I think one of the most important thing, I guess, is to recognize that everything you're discussing is just the American way. So this idea of biblical literacy, who owns the Bible, who gets to say what it means, has always been held by whoever the powerful deem worthy of knowing that. And literacy itself, period. And the crisis of literacy is also something that I face in my profession as a teacher, because, having to teach my students not to take everything at face value is a big part of what I do. And the same thing. I mean, the Bible was twisted to say that slavery was okay. It was twisted to, like, these things have always happened. And I think the thing I always, because it's pretty bad right now. And I think, as usual, a long view of history becomes helpful, especially for the U.S. And recognizing that, especially white people, have no bottom when it comes to wanting to uphold what they deem as their rights and privileges. And just thinking about, I always just remember, like, they would rather shut the schools down than integrate them. That's it. Nobody gets an education because we don't want to integrate the schools. And I think we saw the same thing happening in Glendale when they had the parents kept their kids home from school because they didn't want them in school with trans kids or something. I don't remember all the details, but I remember talking to somebody from Glendale about that. Like, it was like, yeah, we'll just keep the schools empty and no one will get an education because we don't want to associate with whoever it is we deem not worthy of the same thing. And it's just sad and unfortunate. And I think the other thing to remember about the church, especially as somebody who went to church as a kid and and something we talk about a lot here about this idea, questioning and faith. And even if you read the Bible and you ask a question, you're still asked or told to just believe what your pastor says. It doesn't matter if it doesn't make sense, it doesn't matter, because they're like, yes, it doesn't, because it's just like, yes, but you don't understand. And what it really means is this. And that is a huge, it's just a problem in general. As for my personal journey or whatever, I think one of the things I had to figure out what God meant to me. And even reading the Bible and understanding, seeing the contradictions, understanding what Jesus actually said, understanding what God actually said, or it has been reported, and then recognizing that I needed to shift my paradigm a big way. Like, things happen for a reason, and yes, the reason is that people take actions, and actions have consequences. That's it, period. Like, it's not necessarily God's divine purpose that you get in a car accident. It's the person who was driving the other car fell asleep at the wheel. They ran into somebody else that caused an accident. That's what happens. And for me, it was just learning to shift it so that, for me, God is everything good in the world. Like, that's where I just had to come to. God is everything good in the world, because bad things are always happening, but good things are always happening too. And I think that that's been a huge shift in my thinking in terms of that. And I have more, but I feel like I've talked enough. So I'll just let somebody else share now. But that was it. Thanks.
Thanks, Akila. That was really good. Yeah. Somebody else have a comment today? Yeah. Oh, Abe, then pass it back to Sarah, please.
Yeah, I just want to springboard on what Akila was saying, because I think that, like, that sort of, that kind of psychological mindset where it's like, as you mentioned about integrating the schools, that willingness to essentially destroy education before sharing it with sort of an othered group. That kind of, like, nihilism about civilized society, I think, is definitely at play in really a broader. It's like it has expanded beyond just race, to these cultural issues that are, they'd rather see American society completely destroyed than share public space, than share the institution of marriage with LGBT people. Yeah, exactly. And it makes the job of, like, bridge building so incredibly difficult, because it's not just like, oh, well, they'll change their mind when they see our economy in the toilet and, all these horrible consequences of their decisions. They won't necessarily come back just because of that, because next year we're in a recession, maybe a historically bad recession, so it's like, I don't know, like it's a really confounding problem when there's this degree of just pure like nihilism to their whole philosophy and worldview, and I don't know. It's like I feel like we have to concentrate on persuading and finding persuadable people and all that kind of stuff. But we're fighting an extremely difficult and entrenched kind of mindset, that is just, like I said, fundamentally kind of like nihilist in its outlook, where it's like, okay, I don't want to live. I don't want to live in a paradise that shares all of these public institutions with people that I think are morally evil. I don't want to live. I don't care if it's good.
Yeah.
I don't know if I care. I don't care if my life is great, if I'm rich, if everybody's comfortable.
Yeah.
Like there's that like refusal to even live in a great world, because it just goes against what they, this sort of like something that's just so heavily invested in.
Yeah.
So anyway.
Yeah. Good points, guys. Sarah.
This is kind of changing direction, but piggybacking off of what Akila said, believing that God is everything good, I agree. And it's funny because when you're talking about how they believed that God punished them for not, like, God is a punishing God, right? I don't believe in that. But if something good happens to me, I'm immediately like, amen. Like, thank you, God. Like, God is great. Like, thank you. And I don't know, it's just interesting when you were talking about it. Like, I do believe that God is not in control of everything, as scary as that is. I do believe in karma.
Yeah.
And I do believe in like good energy. If you put out good energy, you get back good energy.
Mm-hmm.
And I do believe that God is everything. And so if God is energy, I don't know. It was just something that I was thinking about. Like, that's kind of, it doesn't really all check out, but it's what I believe.
Yeah, again, I think we have to remember the Bible is the story of one particular people's, understanding of God and their place and time. And there's great stuff in there that I think can be wisdom for the ages to help us understand, our understanding of, or come up with our view as well. But this idea that it's, timeless and, and is always the way that God has to be perceived. No, I think it invites us into an exploration of those questions rather than, prescriptive. Like, this is what you have to believe about God. And frankly, I'm with you, Sarah. I think the best parts of the Bible are those parts, and the true parts about theology are the parts that talk about God as love.
Mhm.
And God is, as I think Akila and you have put it, as all that is good and right in the world, and that which calls us into a place of deeper love and appreciation of life and each other as well. And that should be what we mean by the divine. I mean, and I think you find that witness in there. Absolutely. It's part of it, but it's not the only view, right? And again, I think if we see the scriptures as that, which invites us into that conversation rather than here's all the things you have to believe, you know what I mean?
Mhm.
Then I think that's healthy. But yeah, that's good.
It's tricky and it doesn't all necessarily make sense, and that makes it difficult.
Right.
But that's what we do. We sit in the difficultness.
But if we look to our Jewish brothers and sisters, they've always understood this as a conversation. They've always been much more open to, questioning their faith or whatever the rabbi is teaching and engaging in a debate and a dialogue about what does it mean to be the people of God in the world? Who is God? How do we relate to God and how does God relate to us? These were always open-ended questions meant to be explored in community. But evangelicals, especially after the Enlightenment, wanted to turn it into a science, right? And have the certainty and the rigidity and the authoritarian structure to it. It's very Eurocentric as well. I won't get into all that. But yeah, no, it's interesting. Thanks, Sarah. Yeah. We have a couple more minutes. Anybody else has something? Yeah, folks always arrive early. We're supposed to be out of here at 11:30. But anyway, yeah, Jason, go ahead. Yeah.
And Mike?
Yes, please.
My only thought is that I think we give God too much credit when we say that if we're saying that God is a being that is good, I'd much prefer saying that good comes from people, and that there's maybe an emergence of some kind of beingness that comes out of that, but that the Bible, when it's prescriptive, is not saying, or we could take it to mean that it's not saying that there's this good deity that's punishing people, or that wants you to be good, or that justice comes from God. I think it's much more beneficial to say justice comes from us, good comes from us. These are the things you need to do to bring good into the world, and that, is the point.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Amen. Well, everybody, thanks for being here. Next Sunday is June 1st and beginning of Pride Month. And Julie and I are going to be partnering, going back and forth. She'll be speaking next week. And so, we'll have a series, I think, relating to Pride Month. But thank you all for being here. And thank you to all of you who joined us via Zoom. We are done. Go in peace, my friends, and have a lovely holiday weekend. Bye-bye. Thanks for listening in on this week's edition of the Central Cast. Hope you enjoyed it, and hope you join us next time. Bye-bye.